Hi, this is Clint Lanier, Professor of Rhetoric and Professional Communication. I'm going to talk today about crafting an argument specifically with the 5-paragraph essay or with using the 5-paragraph essay. Okay, so let's go over it and see what it's all about and see how we can use it to create a very compelling argument. We're going to talk about, well, first I'm going to give you the description and the purpose of the 5-paragraph essay, and then I'll cover the structure of the 5-paragraph essay, what it's supposed to look like. I bet you never guess how many paragraphs it's supposed to have. And then finally, we'll go over an example, and I'll explain as I'm going through the example kind of what we're doing within that argument. Okay. So what is it? The 5-paragraph essay is a structured essay format designed to create effective arguments. It was probably taught to you in maybe middle school, most likely high school. It's been around for a long time. It's a very easy structure to use. It's also an easy structure to remember when there's only 5 paragraphs. It's effective, but it's not really considered complex. And I have a lot of colleagues in composition that don't like the 5-paragraph essay. They think that it's just too simple, and it really shouldn't be taught or shouldn't be used, that there are better ways to make arguments. But the fact is that the 5-paragraph essay is really effective. I mean, it creates a very cohesive, strong argument if done correctly. And I think it should be taught as kind of the foundation for creating arguments. If you want to make it more complex, that's fine. If you want to use different types of argument structures, that's fine. But this is a very basic tool to use to kind of structure and craft arguments. It's used in various disciplines, and that's why I like it. If you are a professional writer, if your job happens to be rhetoric, if that's what you do, that's great. By all means, create a very compelling, structured argument that will certainly be right for the context or for the occasion of use. But the fact is, most other disciplines simply struggle to communicate effectively. So if you happen to be in engineering, or if you happen to be in accounting or something like that, learning and using the 5-paragraph essay as a method of effectively arguing is really important, and it'll serve you well over the course of your career. One other thing is I took the law school application test, or the LSAT, years and years ago, and there's a portion of the LSAT that is a writing portion. It's an essay portion, and they want you to structure an argument about something. Essentially what they're looking for is a 5-paragraph essay. They're looking for a method where you can state your point of view, and then you can defend that point of view with specific points. Okay, and that's what the 5-paragraph essay allows you to do. So as I said, it might not be complex, and it might be kind of looked down on as not a very complex or perhaps the most effective method for creating an argument, but it is still effective. It's better than having an unorganized kind of mess that you write to somebody. It allows you to get your thoughts out and structured and organized, and it's easy to remember and it's easy to use. So I think it's very effective. But again, that's kind of the description and purpose of it. So what does the structure look like? Well, it has 5 paragraphs. It is a 5-paragraph essay. However, it has 5 paragraphs at a minimum. You can use the same structure and expand it to as broad as you like, as big as you like. You can write a 10-page paper or 25-page paper based on the exact same structure. Now, the 5 paragraphs is really a minimum amount of paragraphs that you really should have if you try to structure a sound, cohesive argument. Okay, the first paragraph introduces the central thesis of your paper, and then it provides 3 key supporting points. That's in the first paragraph. Now, the second, third, and fourth paragraph each one includes one of those supporting points, and then it provides evidence to prove that point. And then also, as we'll see, you expand upon that and you connect that evidence and the point back to your thesis. And then the fifth and final paragraph restates the thesis and supporting points and brings it all back together to state your conclusion or your proof. Okay, that's it. It's really easy. So 5 paragraphs, first paragraph, thesis, and supporting points. 2, 3, 4 are the supporting points, and 5 is your conclusion. That's all it takes to structure a really good cohesive argument. Okay. By the way, a cover letter for a job application, it should be using the 5 paragraph essay for the same reason. Your thesis could be that that you're the right person for the job, and it's because of these 3 reasons, and then each of the following paragraphs kind of provide evidence for those reasons, and then finally a conclusion. So it's the exact same structure as a 5 paragraph essay. Okay, so let's get into it a little bit and look a little bit more closely at the structure. So your thesis, your very first paragraph should contain what's called a thesis statement. A thesis statement essentially is your point of view. It's the argument that you're making. It's a statement about an opinion. Okay, some things about it is very clear and direct, so it's short and it's easy to understand. It's easy to find. It leaves no room for questioning its meaning. It is a statement. It's not a question. In other words, you're stating what you think about something, and there's no room for hedging that. Like, well, I think this or I think that. It's no, this or that is what is the fact is what it is. It makes clear what the argument is. It's an opinion or belief, as I mentioned. So, for example, the U.S. economy is doing better right now than it has in over 30 years. That's my fact. That's my thesis. Okay, President Eisenhower was our greatest president ever. Again, fact, thesis. The most lucrative field a college student can go into is engineering. Now, again, I don't know if that's fact or true, but that's how I'm stating it. And notice that none of those are questions. None of those are asking, maybe the U.S., none of them are hedging. So I'm not saying, well, maybe the U.S. economy is doing better now than it has in over 30 years, or perhaps President Eisenhower was our greatest president ever, or it could be the most lucrative field. No. I'm stating a opinion or belief as a statement, as a clear, factual statement. Now, the next part of my job is to back that up with facts. How do I prove that the U.S. economy is doing better now than it has in over 30 years? Especially to somebody who disagrees with me. And that's the point. So people will agree with you, others will disagree with you. You're trying to prove this to the people that disagree with you, not the people that agree with you. Next, you would have your supporting points. This all takes place in the first paragraph. These are clearly stated after the thesis, and they're providing reasons of why the thesis is true, or why you believe the thesis is true. Should be things that can be proven through examples, data, or other means. Okay, and you need at least 3 of them. So here's some examples. If we were talking about our first thesis, which was the U.S. economy is doing better now than it has in over 30 years. So our supporting points would be the GDP of the U.S. is higher than it has ever been. Unemployment is at record lows, and consumer confidence is at record highs. So those are the 3 reasons why I think the U.S. economy is doing better now than it has over the past 30 years. Now, what about old Eisenhower? So why is he the best president ever? President Eisenhower was brave. That's 1. He understood middle-class America. That's 2. And he worked with all members of either political party. That's 3. So again, 3 supporting reasons of why President Eisenhower was our best president ever. And then finally, that engineering is the most lucrative field a college student can go in. Why? Well, because engineers are consistently in demand, earn a higher income than other majors, and represent the field's improving technology. Those are the 3 reasons why. Now, those all, if you notice, all of them are things that I can demonstrate somehow. So, for example, how would I show that the GDP of the U.S. is higher than it has ever been? Well, that one's easy. All I have to do is look at the numbers. I can look at the current GDP, and then I can look at the GDP over the history of the U.S., excuse me, and it will demonstratively show that the GDP of the U.S. is higher than it ever has been. That's actually true. The next is unemployment. Unemployment is at record low. Again, simply look at trend data or historical data for the past 30 years. Same with the next one. Those are easy. So I would state the point, provide evidence according to this. This is what the unemployment rate has been. This is what it is now. There you go. What about the next one? President Eisenhower was brave. How do I prove that? I would prove that through examples. For example, President Eisenhower served in World War I. He was on the battlefield. He was awarded commendations for valor. Okay, that's how I prove that he was brave. He understood middle-class America. How do I prove that? Perhaps I could demonstrate that how much middle-class America loved him, or maybe quotes about him, or maybe the life that he grew up in, because he didn't grow up rich or anything like that by any means. And he worked with all members of either political party. How would I prove that? Well, I could show the voting records. I could show that perhaps how he vetoed people from his own party and voted with people of the opposing party. So you can see I'd have to get a little bit more creative there because it's not as clear cut. And then finally, engineers are consistently in demand. I can show perhaps the job trend, how many engineering jobs are open right now versus other types of jobs. Earn a higher income than other majors. That's fairly easy to find. There are a lot of organizations that keep track of that stuff. And represents the fields improving technology. That I would have to be a little bit more creative. There's not going to be something that specifically states that, but I would have to demonstrate how maybe engineers work for Tesla, or they work for various companies that are changing our lives, Facebook and so forth, each and every day, for better or for worse, by the way. But you'll see that first one is perhaps the easiest. It gets a little bit harder on that third one, and that second is perhaps the one that I need to be most creative with. And that's something important to remember, is the evidence that you use, you have to be able to find it, and it has to be compelling. Okay? Let me tell you what I mean. If I say the GDP of the US is higher than it has ever been, I can prove that through numerical data. I can find evidence of what the GDP is right now, according to the U.S. government. And then I can look at what the GDP was over the past 30 years. And you'll see that the gross domestic product has climbed over the past 30 years. That's indisputable. Okay? Now, if I move to President Eisenhower was brave, how would I demonstrate that? Okay? In that first one, it's hard to argue against it. It's hard to say, well, those numbers are made up. Well, no, the numbers are derived from whatever organization, and this is how they get them. So it's hard to argue with that first one. But how do I show that President Eisenhower was brave without anybody arguing against me? I could say that he won these commendations for valor on the battlefield during World War I, or wherever it happened to be. So to me, that demonstrates that he was brave. But the point is, that's to me that it demonstrates that he was brave. It might not be to everybody. Somebody could say, well, that doesn't mean anything. He only got that because he went to West Point, or he only got that because of whatever reason. So it's a lot easier to argue against something like that versus the first one. The point is, as much as possible, you want to make sure your supporting points have evidence that's, it's not going to be indisputable, because nothing's indisputable, but at least much more concrete. You don't have to get so creative with finding evidence to prove your point. Okay, so when you look at your supporting points, look at those things. What are the things that you can prove? What are the things that you can demonstrate very easily? And what are the things that would be hard to argue against? So paragraphs 2 through 4 now, we're moving on. They begin with a topic sentence using the same words as a supporting point in the first paragraph. Okay, that's really, really important to remember. Now, why do we do that? We do that because we want the reader to automatically connect that paragraph with the supporting point that we talked about in the first paragraph. Does that make sense? So again, if we say that Eisenhower was our best president, and our first reason is because President Eisenhower was brave, then the first sentence of the next paragraph would say, President Eisenhower was brave, which made him our best president. Okay? I'm using the exact same words. President Eisenhower was brave as the reason, the supporting reason that I use in that first paragraph. Following that, you need to provide at least one compelling piece of evidence that proves this point. Now, I say at least one. I don't want you just to stop at one. You don't have to. You can provide 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces of compelling evidence. Couple of points here. It's compelling. In other words, it's not indisputable, but it's very meaningful, and it's hard to dispute it. So I could say President Eisenhower was brave because he looked brave. Well, that doesn't mean anything. However, I can say President Eisenhower was brave because a survey of people said that he was brave. Well, okay, that's opinion, and that's something I might be able to argue with, but it's certainly a lot better than that first reason, because he looks brave. Or I could say President Eisenhower was brave because he won all these medals for valor on the battlefield because he did these things. He charged a machine gun or whatever it happens to be. That shows that he was brave. That's probably the most piece of compelling evidence, right? It's the most meaningful. It's the one that people can argue with less than any of the other ones. So provide at least one compelling evidence that proves the point. Okay, that the second part of that sentence is proves this point. I often see evidence that really doesn't support the point that the people are trying to make. Okay, make sure that the evidence you're using, not only must it be compelling, but it actually does connect with the topic of that particular paragraph. Next, you want to always provide sources for your evidence, and you do this through citations. Okay, in other words, your evidence has to be just not merely opinion, right? It has to be cited from somewhere. It has to be sourced from somewhere. I have another presentation that discusses persuasion in professional writing. Go look at that one, and I discuss ethos, pathos, and logos. And when you include citations, what you're doing is you are creating credibility for your argument. You are saying, well, these people say X, Y, or Z, or I have gone out and I have done the research for whatever point I'm trying to make. So people can trust you, can trust that the information you're getting is valid information. So it should not just merely be opinion. Now that also goes for the piece of evidence. So opinion in that I could say that Eisenhower is brave because he looks brave, according to some person, some historian says he looks brave, so therefore he's brave. That's not compelling. Now you might cite that, you might cite the historian who said that, or their book or whatever, but again, just the piece of evidence still isn't compelling just because you put a citation in there. So remember this, to include a citation. Now, when I mention citation, it doesn't necessarily have to be a traditional citation. So let's see, for example, something that's written in a journal or something that's written in a book or a magazine or newspaper or whatever. It could also be some artifact or evidence. So you could have an image that that proves your point. So you could say Eisenhower had a very easygoing smile or something like that on his face, and then you can attach a photo and say, see the photo, and that proves the point. I don't know. That's just a random example, but it could be anything. Appendix. It could be tables, graphs, charts that you tack on to the essay that a reader can refer to as the evidence for your point. Okay, but at the very least, there's got to be some type of source for your evidence, right? Next, you want to connect the evidence with a supporting point. So in other words, if I say that Eisenhower was brave, evidence of that was he won these commendations for valor on the battlefield, and then I include a citation that says where I got that, and connecting the evidence to the supporting point would be kind of stating the obvious. Only somebody who is brave would win these commendations for valor. They don't give it away to any soldier. Okay, and then you expand to demonstrate the significance to the thesis. So bravery is important when it comes to being a president. You have to be brave to make the right decisions. You have to be brave in the face of his time during the Cold War. You have to be brave in the face of the USSR. So bravery is very, very important to a president, and that's one of the ingredients that makes him our greatest president ever. Okay, so I hope you understand that. So you're beginning with the exact same sentence that you, or the exact same words for that supporting point that were in the first paragraph. You provide at least one compelling piece of evidence that proves the point. Always provide sources for that evidence. You connect that evidence back to the supporting point, and then you expand to demonstrate the significance to the thesis itself. So what counts as evidence? As I mentioned, you could use examples, cited examples. You could use precedents. So something like this, this has happened before. So we do that in law, for example. In law, we look at court cases and we say, how has it been ruled in previous similar cases? And then we use that as precedent. So this is what it should be because over here this is what it was. We can use authority as evidence. In other words, if the U.S. government says X, Y, or Z, or if NASA says X, Y, or Z, we can point at them and say, look, they're saying X, Y, and Z. They're an authority on this. And we can have an analogy of a similar case. In other words, something like this happened before, and this is the outcome of that. This is very similar to that, so we could expect this to happen just like that other case. All right, different types of evidence, but all of them should include sources or references. Okay, some type of citation. And then your final paragraph simply restates the thesis, restates the supporting point, and essentially ties it all together to demonstrate that you've proven your thesis or you've proven your argument. Okay. So let's look at some general questions that people might have about the 5-paragraph essay. Does it have to be 5 paragraphs? Again, it doesn't have to be 5 paragraphs. It can be as long as you want, but it has to be a minimum of 5 paragraphs. 3 supporting points are enough to really provide enough evidence to prove a thesis. Okay, anything less than that, and it's easy to come up with counter arguments for it. But what you're doing is you're overwhelming us with supporting points. You're demonstrating to us that whatever your thesis is true because of all of these reasons. Right? How long can it be? Again, it could be a book. When you do something like that, all you do is you expand it. So now, let's say you have a 25-page paper. Well, instead of having a single paragraph for your first paragraph, you can expand that to an introduction section. And the entire introduction would create a framework for the rest of the argument. It can become more complex and it can become more complicated. But you can use essentially the same rationale, which is that a thesis needs to be supported by multiple reasons, and those reasons need to be have evidence to prove them. It's the same rationale, but it's just expanded as long as you want it to. Now, does it have to be organized this way? Yes, it does. The very first part of the argument has to clearly state a thesis somewhere. It also needs to explicitly state the supporting points for that thesis. And then following sections need to prove each of those points. What if you have no sources for your evidence? Well, you need to find sources for your evidence, frankly, or it has to be so compelling that it can't be argued. So perhaps research that you carried out yourself, but even if it was research that you carried out yourself, your evidence is going to be the data or the results of that research. So let's say you did survey research. You could provide the survey answers or survey results, and that would be sources for your evidence. Okay, so you're always going to have some type, unless it's purely opinion. In that case, you probably want to leave it alone. Just go ahead and drop it. So let's look at an example. Here we have the first paragraph of a very simple, very brief 5-paragraph essay. So paragraph 1. In order to gain more tax revenue, the United States needs to lower the corporate income tax. It sounds nonsensical, but it has demonstrated my apologies, but it has been demonstrated to work in the 1920s, the 1960s, and again in the 1980s. Okay? So here, what is our thesis statement? Thesis statement is just the very first sentence. It is that to gain more tax revenue, the United States needs to lower corporate income tax. And then our supporting reasons is that it has been demonstrated in the 1920s. Second reason it was demonstrated in the 1960s. Third reason, it was demonstrated in the 1980s. Okay, so very clear cut, only 2 sentences stating a thesis, providing the supporting points. Let's look at paragraph 2. In the 1920s, the U.S. government cut the income tax rate from 70 to 25%. Now, if we go back to the previous paragraph, I say it worked in the 1920s. This paragraph says in the 1920s. So I can easily connect those two. The result was a great increase in income tax revenue. The amount of tax collected in 1921 was $719 million. However, the tax collected in 1928 was $1,164 million. So at $1.1 billion. Okay, and then I provide a citation. So essentially, the topic sentence is it's the topic phrase really is the first two. In the income tax, in the 1920s, the U.S. government cut the income tax rate from 70 to 25, and the result was a great increase in income tax revenue. That goes back to support my thesis. Now, let me prove that. I prove it simply through these numbers from one source. Now I'm going to connect those two. The increase of 61% was a direct result of the tax cut implemented in the 1920s. Okay, and I'm expanding on it. Simply put, when taxes were lowered, people had more money to spend and invest. Those investments in their own businesses or others led to higher employment and wages, which all subsequently led to more income tax being paid and therefore more revenue for the U.S. government. That very last sentence connects back to my thesis, which is if you want to raise revenue for the U.S. government, you need to lower taxes. Okay, that's exactly what that's saying. So here, again, in the very first sentence, first 2 sentences really, we have the topic sentence for the paragraph, and this is the reason, one of my supporting reasons. Second sentence is direct evidence that proves that first sentence. The third and fourth sentences connect this point back to my thesis, and then the last sentence expands it and discusses the significance of this point to what the thesis is. Paragraph 3. In the 1960s, the U.S. government implemented another major tax cut. The top tax rate in the U.S. went from 90 to 70%. The results were a 62% increase in tax revenue, 33% adjusted for inflation, from $94 billion in 1961 to $153 billion in 1968. Same source here. Once again, Americans were able to keep more of their income, and so they chose to spend it and invest it rather than hoard it or in other ways take it out of the economy. Both arguments today for not decreasing the tax rate. Right? So again, we have same topic sentence, which is a supporting reason that they cut it in the 1960s. Then I have evidence to prove that cutting it at that time raised income for the government. And then I connect in that very last sentence, I connect all of this back to my thesis. Paragraph 4, I think you see where this is going. Finally, in the 1980s, many Americans were burdened by high inflation and high taxes implemented in the 1970s. In 1983, the Reagan administration cut the personal income tax rate, and again, income tax revenues increased. In total, the revenue to the U.S. government from income taxes rose 54% or 28% adjusted for inflation by 1989. Yet again, with lower income taxes come higher revenue for the U.S. government and also the nation. I realize that in my first paragraph I said corporate income tax, and I apologize. That should have been personal income tax. In any case, I have the topic sentence. I then prove that topic sentence, and then I connect it back to my central thesis. And then finally, the last paragraph. In conclusion, it may seem counterintuitive, but if the U.S. government wants to raise the tax revenue, it should lower the tax rates. The proof of this working can be seen in the 3 biggest tax reforms in America's history: the tax cuts of the 1920s, the 1960s, and the 1980s. In each of these periods, the U.S. government cut tax rates from corporate to personal, and in all 3 periods, the U.S. government gained more revenue as a result. So, again, in conclusion, and then I state my thesis, and then I state the supporting points once more, and then I essentially wrap it up because I have proven my point through the evidence and through the supporting points that I have. And then, of course, there's my source. Okay. So very briefly, that's how you structure a sound argument with a 5-paragraph essay. It may not be complex. It may not be a complicated method of of creating an argument, but it is a very effective method of creating an argument. The most important points to remember is that the very first paragraph must contain a thesis statement and 3 supporting points. Each of the subsequent paragraphs must then state the supporting point and then prove the supporting point with evidence. And then finally, the conclusion will restate the thesis, restate the supporting points, and then connect it back and wrap it up. Okay? And that's it. That's how to write a 5-paragraph essay. Thank you once again for watching this. If you are one of my students and you have questions about this, please send me an email. If you are not one of my students and you have a question about this, please put a comment down below and I will answer it just as soon as I can. Once again, this is Clint Lanier, Professor of Rhetoric and Professional Communication, and this was Crafting an Argument with the 5-Paragraph Essay. Thank you.